Let me be clear, I don't believe in cruelty. But when we say torture, we're not talking about harm. We're talking about exposure, the kind that reveals the truth, the kind that flips power back into your hands. When you're dealing with a narcissist, whether in love, family, friendship, or the workplace, the real weapon isn't revenge. It's understanding the brain, their brain, your brain, and how to detach, disarm, and dominate through strategy, not emotion. Let's get something straight. Narcissists aren't just selfish. They are addicted to validation like a drug. They live off control. They feed on your attention, your anger, even your silence if it's rooted in pain. So if you want to stop being their supply or turn the tables, here's the truth. You don't beat a narcissist by fighting them. You beat them by becoming immune to them. And that, biologically speaking, is power. You want to get under a narcissist's skin? You don't yell. You don't fight. You don't beg or argue or try to outsmart them with louder words. That's not how you shift the power dynamic. The first and most effective move is this. You stop feeding their ego. The truth is, narcissists aren't built on strength. They're built on mirrors. Attention, admiration, praise, validation. These aren't just things they like. They are things they need. They survive on it. Without it, their entire identity begins to rot from the inside out. And that's not an exaggeration. From a neurological standpoint, their dopamine reward system is completely dysregulated. The moment they sense admiration, the brain floods with reward chemicals. But when that attention disappears, withdrawal, agitation, panic. That's the biological reaction. Like any addict, they start to chase the next hit. That's where you come in. Not as a supplier, but as a withdrawal. You cut the cord, you pull the plug, you go emotionally flat. That's the torture. Not the fight, not the argument. The void. Because here's how it works. When you used to get pulled into their storm, they watched every reaction like data. If you got upset, they saw they still mattered. If you defended yourself, they knew you still cared about their opinion. If you tried to reason with them, they interpreted that as control. So what do you do now? You break that cycle. When they throw the bait, you don't bite. When they attack your character, you don't defend it. When they push for drama, you don't give them the stage. You become emotionally unavailable to their games. That doesn't mean you become cold or fake. It means you become centered, still, neutral. Think of it like standing in the middle of a windstorm, but choosing not to sway. That's how you confuse them. That's how you gain the upper hand. Not by reacting, but by not reacting. The less you respond, the more their internal world begins to crack. And make no mistake, they feel it. When the mirror goes dark, they lose sight of who they are. And that's terrifying for someone who doesn't know themselves without an audience. Now, I want to make something clear. This kind of silence isn't about being passive. It's about being powerful. You are choosing to remove yourself from the arena. You're no longer playing a rigged game. And in that choice, you force them to sit with something they've spent their entire life avoiding, themselves. At first, they'll panic. You'll see it. The attempts will increase. They'll poke, provoke, maybe even try to love bomb, not because they care, but because they're starving. And when you don't respond to the sweet words or the threats or the guilt, they spiral. Their brain doesn't know how to make sense of your stillness. You've become unpredictable. And unpredictable people are dangerous to narcissists because they can't control what they can't predict. What's important is that you hold the line. No flinching, no explaining, no just one more conversation. You are no longer their mirror, no longer their drug, no longer their fix. And that absence, that's what drives them into psychological chaos. Not the yelling, not the revenge, just the absence, the peace. This is where people underestimate their own power. You think saying nothing is weak? You think not responding is giving up? No, it's warfare. Strategic, Biological, you are dismantling the very reward loop that kept them attached to you. You are training their brain, whether they know it or not, that you are no longer a source of supply. And every time you resist the urge to engage, you are rewiring your own nervous system too. You are becoming stronger, clearer, free. And here's the final truth. When you no longer react, they no longer exist in your psychological space. You don't need to punish them. You don't need to expose them. Their own emptiness will do that for you. You just have to stop playing the role they wrote for you in their script, step off their stage, and watch the entire act collapse. Because nothing tortures a narcissist more than being completely irrelevant. You want to shake the foundation of a narcissist without ever raising your voice? Start by praising someone they secretly envy. That's it. Not an insult, not a confrontation, just a well-placed, authentic compliment to someone they perceive as competition. The reaction you'll trigger, it's not visible on the surface, not immediately, but inside it ignites a firestorm. Because what you're doing in that moment is challenging the core of their identity. Narcissists live through comparison. Their sense of superiority isn't built on being good, it's built on being better. Better than you, better than them, better than everyone. They don't just want to shine, they want everyone else dimmed around them. This is biological. In the narcissist brain, social comparison isn't just a thought, it's a trigger. Their dopamine and cortisol levels shift based on perceived dominance. When they believe they're on top, they're calm, controlled, inflated. But when someone else shines brighter, especially someone close to their territory, whether it's in talent, intelligence, looks, or status, their internal chemistry shifts. You'll see it. The tight jaw, the fake smile, the subtle dismissal, maybe even a sarcastic comment. That's not confidence. That's panic, dressed up as pride. And you don't have to be loud about it. You don't have to weaponize the compliment. Just make it real. You know, she handled that situation with a lot of grace. Or, that guy's got sharp instincts. He always sees 3 steps ahead. Say it once, genuinely, and move on. The key is in the nonchalance. You're not performing for the narcissist. You're simply showing that your attention is no longer orbiting around them. That your admiration is now a currency they don't control. That breaks something inside of them. Because for a narcissist, attention is like oxygen. But the specific attention, the admiration of being the best, being the most impressive in the room, that's the purest oxygen. The moment they feel you admiring someone else, their brain reads it as a threat. Not logically, biologically. The threat isn't physical, it's existential. You've made them feel less than. Even if they don't show it on their face, trust this. Underneath that surface, they're unraveling. Not because you insulted them, but because you ignored the script. The narcissist writes a silent contract with every close relationship. You admire me, you lift me, and you never threaten my status. The moment you violate that by showing respect or admiration to someone they see as superior, or even equal, they feel betrayed because their worth is dependent on being the central figure of your world, the alpha, the expert, the admired. So when you shift your gaze elsewhere, you force them to confront their deepest insecurity, that they're not enough without domination. You might notice what happens after: subtle competition, backhanded comments about the person you praised, a sudden story that one-ups what that person did. Yeah, but I handled something harder. Or I knew that already. It's not random. That's their brain trying to reestablish control over the social hierarchy. It's their identity fighting to get back on top. But here's where you take control. You don't feed it. You don't argue. You don't correct. You don't say that's not true. You just keep admiring what's real, what's grounded, what's earned. Because the narcissist can't survive in a space where admiration is based on merit. They only thrive in fantasy. You destroy the fantasy by keeping your validation authentic and free. That's the deepest irony. Narcissists crave admiration, but fear real competition. Because real competition means someone else might win, so they play in fake arenas, rigged games, controlled narratives. But when you praise someone they didn't choose, someone they can't control, especially someone whose strengths highlight their own insecurities, you expose them to reality. And reality for the narcissist is the most painful place to live. So you want to torture them? Celebrate excellence around them that doesn't involve them. Talk about how someone's integrity moved you, how someone's creativity inspired you, how someone's leadership grounded you. And watch what happens, not in their words, but in their silence. That silence will be loud. It will be burning, because it's not about the compliment itself, it's about what it represents. That you see value in others, that you recognize power outside of them, and that your world is no longer revolving around the illusion they built. You want to dismantle a narcissist's power without ever touching them? You master your nervous system. That's it. Emotional neutrality, calm, stillness. That's the real disruption. Because narcissists don't operate in truth, they operate in chaos. Their control thrives on your reaction. They create confusion so they can define the rules. They escalate tension so they can offer false peace. They poke, prod, bait, and spin situations to get you to explode, collapse, or explain. And every time you do, they win. Because they weren't looking for resolution, they were looking for evidence that they control your emotional state. Here's what's happening under the surface. The narcissist is scanning for weakness. Not physical weakness, emotional openness. And not the healthy kind of openness. They look for volatility, inconsistency, wounds they can press on. So when you get defensive, it validates that they've struck a nerve. When you cry, it confirms they've cracked your self-worth. When you rage, they see your energy pouring into them, and that's all they need. To them, a reaction is power. It tells them you still care what they think. It tells them your sense of self is still entangled with their approval. So what do you do instead? You hold your frame. You stay calm. Not distant, not cold, just stable. You keep your voice level, your breathing smooth, your face relaxed. You slow down, because when your nervous system doesn't match their chaos, it short circuits their strategy. They don't know how to proceed. They're trying to pull you into the storm, but you're anchoring into the ground. That's not passivity, that's power. There's a reason this is so effective. From a neurobiological perspective, we co-regulate with the people around us. Emotions are contagious. Anger breeds anger. Anxiety breeds anxiety. But the inverse is also true. Stillness breeds stillness. And narcissists can't stand that, because in the presence of someone emotionally stable, they lose control of the environment. They lose the ability to shape the narrative. That's why they escalate when you stay calm. That's why they push harder when you don't flinch. They are desperately trying to provoke something, anything, because your peace is exposing their lack of it. And here's the thing, this isn't about being fake. It's about training. You don't become emotionally steady by pretending. You become emotionally steady by learning how to recognize your own triggers, track your breath, notice your heart rate, and stay present in your body. You learn how to detach from the story being spun around you. You start asking yourself in real time, is this about me, or is this a trap? Is this moment designed to resolve something, or is it a test of control? When you train that awareness, the game changes. You start to see their tactics before they finish their sentence. You feel the tension rising, but you don't rise with it. You become an observer, not passive, but awake. You see the button they're trying to press, and you let it stay unpressed. And in that silence, they meet something they didn't expect: themselves. Chris, their own emptiness, their own spiraling need for control. There's nothing more uncomfortable for a narcissist than facing their own instability in the presence of your calm. It's not just a contrast, it's a mirror. And they can't twist your calm into a weakness because it doesn't react. They can't turn it into guilt because it's not apologetic. It just is. And that's what breaks the cycle. Now, sometimes they'll escalate, push harder, accuse, play victim. That's the desperation rising. That's the storm trying to suck you in. But you stay grounded. You speak when it's necessary. You respond with clarity, not emotion. You don't explain yourself to prove a point. You let your presence be the point. The quieter you get, the louder their fear becomes. Because they realize something terrifying. They can't move you anymore. That's what they fear. Not being hated, not being blocked, but being irrelevant. The moment they can no longer shift your emotional state is the moment they become powerless. Because their power was never in who they were, it was in how much of you they could manipulate. And when you reclaim that, they've got nothing left. There's something profoundly powerful about saying one word, no, and leaving it there. No justification, no apology, no extra words trying to soften the blow, just no. When you say it with calm, when you mean it, and when you hold it, that single word becomes a wall narcissists can't climb. And it drives them insane because narcissists don't hear no as a boundary, they hear it as a challenge. Their entire psychological structure is built on overriding others' limits. Every time they push and you bend, you reinforce their belief that they can manipulate their way through anything. But the moment you don't bend, the moment you say no, and it doesn't tremble, that's the moment their strategy fails. And that's the key, not just saying no, but saying it without performing. You don't owe them an explanation. You don't have to prove that your boundary is fair. Narcissists will always twist your reasoning anyway. They'll use it against you, poke holes in it, spin it until it looks unreasonable. But when you don't give them anything to spin, when you offer no angle to grip onto, they're left standing in front of a door they can't open. They knock louder, they kick, they demand, but nothing happens. That's the shift. That's when the power dynamic begins to flip. Here's what you have to understand. To a narcissist, boundaries are obstacles to be negotiated, not respected. They don't believe in a firm no because they believe they're entitled to your yes. So the first time you say no, they'll probably test you, not with a full frontal assault, but with subtle tactics. Guilt, flattery, pity. Come on, it's not that serious. Or you used to do this before. Or you're making this harder than it has to be. That's the first wave, manipulation disguised as reason. And it's tempting to give in, not because you're weak, but because you're trained. Narcissists condition people to question their own limits, to believe that peace only comes through compliance. But here's the truth. Peace doesn't come from giving in. Peace comes from staying rooted. When you say no, and when you refuse to elaborate, you force the narcissist to deal with something they hate, your autonomy. And autonomy is dangerous to them because it means you're not under their spell anymore. It means they don't own your decisions. You're no longer a predictable source of supply. You're now a person with your own compass. And they don't know how to control that. They'll try to provoke emotion to break your stance. Anger, accusation, silence. But your job isn't to react, it's to hold. No matter how loud the storm gets, you hold your center. And that doesn't mean you're rude. It doesn't mean you're cold or cruel. It means you're clear. You can say no with warmth. You can say no with grace, but you say it with finality. Because narcissists don't hear tone, they hear permission. If your no has even a crack of hesitation, they will wedge themselves inside it and pry it open. So you have to treat your no like a closed door with a deadbolt. Not locked out of spite, but locked because your peace lives on the other side. It's not just about denying them access, it's about reclaiming yours. Every time you say no, you're saying yes to your self-respect. You're reinforcing to your own nervous system that you are allowed to protect your energy, that you don't exist to meet demands or play roles that exhaust you, that your value isn't tied to how much you tolerate. And that's the reprogramming, because it's not just about breaking their control. It's about undoing the pattern in you that let it exist. You'll feel it the first time you say no and don't back down. There's discomfort, there's silence, maybe even backlash. But right behind that is something else. Strength, clarity, a grounded sense of who you are. And once you feel that, once your nervous system experiences what it's like to stand firm and not collapse, you start to understand what real power is. Not domination, not volume, just the quiet confidence of knowing your boundaries don't need permission to exist. When you say no and you leave it there, you're not rejecting them, you're choosing you. And that choice, repeated consistently, becomes a fortress they can't penetrate. You want to throw a narcissist completely off balance? Don't scream. Don't argue. Don't play the emotional tug of war they've mastered. Instead, reflect their behavior back to them, gently, precisely, without raising your heart rate even a beat. It's not about revenge. It's not even about confronting them. It's about exposing them without ever using a weapon. Because the truth is, narcissists thrive in distortion. They live in manipulation, in narrative control, in subtle rewriting of events. Until you start to doubt your own memory, they gaslight, they twist, they make you feel like you're too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. And they do it so smoothly, so calmly, that you almost believe it yourself. But when you begin to reflect those same distortions back to them, calmly, without accusation, they stumble. Because for once, they're forced to look in the mirror. And the mirror isn't shouting, it's not accusing, it's just showing what's there. You say things like, "That's an interesting way to see it, but that's not what happened." Or, "It sounds like you're projecting a little." You don't yell, you don't beg to be understood, you don't try to win the point. You hold the line with steady energy and let them feel the weight of their own tactics. Here's why this works. From a psychological standpoint, narcissists are not used to being challenged by facts delivered without emotion. They know how to fight emotion, they feed off it. But calm logic, that's disarming. That's uncomfortable. That's unfamiliar terrain. When you remove your emotional charge and instead point out the manipulation with surgical clarity, they can't spin it the same way. They're used to you being reactive. They expect you to get flustered. But when you don't, they lose their script. Because the whole game relies on getting you emotionally involved. Once you're emotionally involved, you're easier to twist. But when you're not, when you're calm, grounded, and speaking with clarity, you become unreadable. And unreadable people are dangerous to narcissists. They can't control what they can't predict. You might say, "You've said that before, and the outcome was different than you're describing." Or, "That feels like you're shifting responsibility again." Or even, "That doesn't align with what was actually said." These are not attacks. These are observations. You're not trying to prove a point. You're simply not letting them rewrite the moment. And that refusal, delivered in such measured tone, destabilizes them. They can't erupt because you haven't triggered the fight. They can't flip it back on you because you haven't given them chaos. What you've given them is accountability. And that's the one thing their ego is not built to absorb. They may respond with confusion or sudden defensiveness or even laughter, anything to recover control. But you don't chase their reaction, you let it sit. That's the hard part, learning to let the discomfort belong to them. Because for so long, you've been trained to carry the tension, to fix things, to smooth it over. But this time you don't. You let them stew in their own contradiction. You let the silence stretch after your words. You let them feel the subtle unraveling of their story when it's no longer accepted as truth. And what you'll notice is something subtle, but powerful. They'll try to pivot, they'll deflect, change the subject, redirect blame. That's a good sign. That means they're cornered, not by you, but by the truth. And the truth is heavier than anything you could shout. So you don't follow them into the distraction. You don't respond to the new bait. You just stay right where you are, rooted in clarity, letting your words do what their manipulation can't. Reveal instead of distort. This is how you begin to reclaim your reality. Not by convincing the narcissist, but by no longer being confused by them. By showing them, in your posture, in your tone, in your restraint, that you're no longer living in their version of the story. You've stepped out of their frame. And that's when they start to see the cracks in their control. Not because you screamed it at them, but because you handed them a mirror and stayed still while they looked. And the moment they realize you're no longer playing their game, that's the moment their power dissolves. You want to deal a blow to a narcissist that they never saw coming? You grow. You level up. You evolve. Not to get back at them, not to prove anything, but because you finally realize they were never the source of your worth to begin with. And when you do that, when you start building a life that doesn't orbit around their opinion or their presence, you deliver the kind of psychological blow that no confrontation ever could. Because the narcissist's entire illusion is built on one core belief, that you need them, that your glow came from their light, that without their validation, you're nothing. So the moment you rise without them, the fantasy fractures, and the deeper truth sinks in. You were always the source, they were just standing in front of the mirror. When you start to take your power back, quietly, intentionally, it shakes something inside them they can't name. Not because you're rubbing it in their face, but because your very existence begins to contradict the story they told themselves about you. They said you were lost. They said you were broken. They said you were difficult, needy, emotional, dependent. But now you're grounded. You're steady. You're doing things they said you'd never do. Healing in ways they said weren't possible for you. Smiling without them in the frame. And that smile, that's what they can't handle. Not because it's loud, but because it's real. See, the narcissist doesn't actually want you broken. They want you dependent. There's a difference. They want you strong enough to serve them, but not strong enough to leave. The moment you begin to outgrow the dynamic, when you no longer need their approval to breathe, you become dangerous. Because now they're irrelevant to your future. And irrelevance to a narcissist is worse than hatred. They don't care if you hate them. They'll take hate over indifference any day. Hatred means you're still emotionally hooked, still reacting, still playing the game. But when you detach, when you build your life without looking back, you remove the final thread of their control. And here's what's interesting. Your growth doesn't even have to be explosive. It doesn't have to be loud. You don't need to start a company, move across the country, or reinvent your identity overnight. Sometimes it's the subtle changes that shake them the most. Waking up with clarity instead of confusion. Saying no without fear. Smiling without performing. Holding eye contact without shrinking. That's power. That's self-possession. That's what they told you you'd never have. And now without them, you found it. They'll notice. Even if you're not in contact, even if you're silent, trust me, they feel it. They'll check in, subtly or directly, a random message, a mutual friend drop, a subtle comment online, because they're testing the waters. They want to see if the hook is still in. But when they see your peace, your real, regulated, grounded peace, they get the message. You're no longer available for their cycle. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're just done. And that is something their ego doesn't know how to process. Because narcissists expect destruction when people leave. They expect chaos. They expect a reaction. But when you leave with grace and grow in silence, you dismantle the very identity they projected onto you. And let's be honest, it's not easy to get there. You don't just wake up one day and stop caring. You have to unlearn the conditioning. You have to fight through the part of you that still wants their approval, that still wonders if they were right. But each step you take away from their voice and toward your own truth rewires your brain. Every boundary you enforce, every lie you stop internalizing, every piece of yourself you reclaim, that's the work. And it adds up, quietly, slowly, until one day you look in the mirror and realize you're not the same person who tolerated that treatment anymore. You outgrew the story they wrote for you. And when that happens, the narcissist starts to fade. Not because you blocked them, not because you destroyed them, but because you healed the part of yourself that once needed them. And when the need dies, so does their power. You've stopped being a source of supply. You've started being a source of strength. Your evolution becomes the evidence, not just that you survived, but that you transcended. You became something they never imagined you could be without them, whole. There's a kind of defiance that doesn't come from resistance. It comes from joy. And to a narcissist, that's the ultimate insult, because when they see you laughing, when they see you smiling, genuinely present and light in a moment they thought they had crushed, it sends a ripple through the illusion they've built. Narcissists don't just want control over your life, they want control over your emotions. And joy, that's the one thing they believe you don't deserve without them. So when you start to feel light again, when your nervous system stops responding to their chaos, when you find yourself laughing, not in spite, but in freedom, they don't know what to do with that. Joy is the language they don't speak, because it doesn't depend on approval. It doesn't bow to manipulation. It exists outside of their control, and that's why it terrifies them. They're used to seeing you folded, apologetic, confused, hesitant. They're used to the version of you that tiptoes, overthinks, over-explains, but then one day, they see something different. Maybe you're surrounded by people who get you. Maybe you're just out somewhere, enjoying the simplicity of a moment, unfiltered, unguarded. They see the way your eyes light up, the way you carry yourself, the calm in your face. And in that second, they realize something devastating. Their grip is gone. Because joy is proof that the cycle is broken. Not forced happiness, not social media smiles or performative peace. Real joy, the kind that comes from no longer questioning your worth, the kind that comes from knowing you're safe. Not because they said so, but because you've learned how to protect yourself. When you find joy again, you're not just healing, you're building a life that doesn't include their voice as a narrator. And that disrupts the foundation of who they think they are. See, narcissists don't need you to be miserable. They just need you to be less than joyful. They want you tolerating, surviving, functioning, but never thriving. Because the moment you thrive, the moment you smile without their permission, you become a mirror to their failure. Not a personal failure. They'll never admit that. But a failure in control. They fail to destroy the light in you. They fail to make their absence feel like a punishment. And instead, they're watching you glow. What makes this even more unsettling for them is that your joy exposes a deeper truth. That they weren't the source of your happiness to begin with. They were just the noise, the interference, the distraction from a part of you that was always there, quiet, buried, waiting to be reclaimed. And now that it's coming back, they can't do anything to stop it. They might try, but joy doesn't engage with manipulation. It doesn't argue. It doesn't flinch. It just is. And here's where you have to be intentional. Because it's easy to dim your light when you know someone's watching. When you know your peace might provoke discomfort. But your job isn't to protect their illusion. Your job is to protect your truth. If your laughter bothers them, let it. If your peace makes them uncomfortable, good. That means it's working. Because your healing isn't meant to be palatable to the people who hurt you. It's meant to be yours. Unapologetic, fully felt. You'll notice they might circle back, send a message, test the waters. They'll frame it as curiosity, concern, nostalgia. But what they're really doing is checking your emotional temperature. So They want to know if the joy they saw was real or just temporary. They want to know if there's still a crack in the wall they once walked through with ease. And when they find it sealed, when they find your peace not just intact but growing, they'll back off. Because they know, on a level they can't explain, that your joy has become armor. And this isn't about pretending. It's not about faking positivity to prove a point. That's not healing. That's performance. This is about building a life where joy returns naturally, quiet mornings where you feel rested, conversations that don't leave you drained, moments of laughter that feel like breathing again. That's the real win. Not revenge, not vindication, just the quiet realization that they're no longer part of your emotional ecosystem. When you can smile and mean it, truly mean it, without checking to see who's watching, you've already won. There's a silence that speaks louder than any confrontation, a kind of ending that doesn't need closure, not because you don't deserve it, but because you finally understand that waiting for it is just another form of control. Narcissists crave closure, but not the kind that brings peace. They want a final scene, a last act, where they either come out as the hero, the victim, or the misunderstood genius. They want to script the ending so they're still at the center, still pulling the strings, still echoing in your mind. But when you walk away without offering that scene, when you don't deliver the drama, when you don't pick up the pen and write the last chapter with them, you take back the very thing they've been trying to hold on to the whole time, your attention. And that's the most powerful move you can make. Not the goodbye speech, not the parting truth bomb, not the "this is what you did to me" list, just silence, just distance, just walking away with clarity and not looking back to see if they're watching, because they are. Always. Not necessarily to reconcile, but to monitor, to see if the hook is still in, to see if you'll reach out, explain yourself, second guess, give them something to work with. But when you don't, when you let the story end without a script, that's when the real fracture happens in their reality. You see, narcissists don't fear abandonment the way healthy people do. They fear irrelevance. They fear being erased from your mind, your heart, your narrative, because to them, being remembered is power. If they can linger in your head, if they can live in your emotional reactions, they're still winning. Even if you've walked away physically, if they've got your energy, your resentment, your confusion, they're still there. That's why closure is so tempting. You want to feel complete. You want to understand, you want the ending to make sense. But with a narcissist, it never will. Because they never played fair to begin with. They distorted every part of the story. And the moment you accept that, the moment you stop needing answers from someone who never gave you honesty, is the moment you free yourself. It's not easy. Your brain will crave resolution. It's how we're wired. Unfinished stories create stress, mental loops, restlessness. That's what narcissists rely on. They leave gaps, open threads, so you keep spinning. And maybe one day you do reach out. Just for clarity, just for peace, just to say, hey, can we end this respectfully? But what you'll find is that your vulnerability will be used as leverage. They won't offer closure. They'll offer confusion, more projection, more blame. Maybe even a fake apology, just enough to reopen the wound. That's not healing, that's a relapse. So what do you do instead? You close the door yourself. You let it end without the scene. You write your own final page, and you don't hand it to them for approval. You don't need their understanding to validate your healing. You don't need their permission to move on. And when you do that, when you choose peace over performance, you create a silence they can't stand. Because it's not avoidance, it's power. They might try to bait you after that. A subtle message, a story posted just for you, a coincidental run-in, but none of it is random. It's their way of knocking on a door they once had the key to, and this time you don't answer. Not because you're angry, but because there's nothing left to say. You've outgrown the role. You've moved past the need to explain. You've realized that the real closure isn't in the conversation, it's in the disconnection. And here's what's incredible. Once your mind stops spinning for answers, your body starts to relax. Your sleep gets deeper. Your breath gets slower. Your thoughts get clearer. That's the biological proof that you're healing. Not in the words exchanged, but in the silence kept. You're no longer waiting for a response that will never come. You're no longer making space for a person who only brought distortion. And the narcissist, they're left with the one thing they never wanted. Quiet, no applause, no attention, no final bow,